Once upon a time, in an era defined not by the clash of broadswords or the roar of open artillery, but by the silent, invisible machinations of men operating in the shadows, the world was cleaved in two. To the west lay the grand, sophisticated nation of Westalia, and to the east the stern, heavily militarized nation of Austania. A fragile, trembling peace hung between these two global superpowers, maintained not by the goodwill of their political leaders, but by the tireless, bloody efforts of intelligence agencies operating beneath the surface of civilized society. It was a time of pervasive suspicion, where a misplaced word could spark a global inferno, and where the most crucial battles were fought in dimly lit alleyways, lavish dining halls, and the quiet corners of the human mind. The delicate equilibrium of this Cold War was violently shaken when a distinguished Westalian diplomat met his untimely demise on a slick, rain-washed Austanian highway. To the untrained eye of the general public, the incident was quickly dismissed as a tragic, unavoidable car accident. The local Austanian constabulary filed their reports, citing poor visibility and excess speed. However, deep within the secure, smoke-filled subterranean chambers of Westalian intelligence, an agency known strictly as WISE, a vastly different narrative was being meticulously constructed. The heads of the intelligence directorate gathered around a heavy, scarred oak cable, the room illuminated only by the harsh, flickering glow of a slide projector. They reviewed the forensic evidence, the tire trajectories, and the political climate with sharp, calculating eyes. The conclusion was unanimous and chilling. The crash was no accident. It was a deliberate, expertly orchestrated assassination executed by Austania's far-right political party. Believing fervently that this militant political party was actively plotting to shatter the truth and ignite the apocalyptic fires of a new devastating war against Westalia, the directors of WISE knew they had to act with unprecedented urgency. They needed to infiltrate the enemy's inner circle and uncover their clandestine plans before the spark could catch and consume the continent. The situation demanded an operative of unparalleled skill, a phantom capable of slipping through the microscopic cracks of the oppressive Austanian security apparatus. Without a moment's hesitation, one of the senior directors leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together in the dim light, and suggested they deploy their absolute greatest asset. They would send the man who had no face, no past, and no true name. They would send the master spy known only by his legendary code name, Twilight. Miles away from the grim, strategic meeting rooms of Westalius, the neon lights of an Austanian city cut through the heavy evening gloom, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. Inside a quiet, unassuming office building, an anxious private investigator sat across from a sharply dressed man who presented him with highly sensitive, incredibly lucrative blackmail material. The evidence consisted of a series of compromising, high-resolution photographs detailing a prominent foreign minister named Edgar. The photographs were undeniably authentic and devastating to the minister's pride, capturing the precise, humiliating moment his meticulously crafted artificial toupee was lifted and impressed by a sudden, treacherous gust of wind. The investigator, a man driven by greed and utterly convinced he was securing the deal of a lifetime, handed over the requisite files. The sharply dressed man who had taken the photographs and secured the delicate negatives nodded silently. He gathered the materials, offered a polite, utterly forgettable smile, and slipped out of the office, disappearing into a waiting black car. A mere moment later, the heavy wooden door of the office swung open with violent force. In stepped the real Minister Edgar, flanked by a cadre of heavily armed men, ready to retrieve his stolen dignity. The investigator's blood ran ice cold as the terrifying realization struck him. He had been masterfully, flawlessly played. The man who had just left the room was none other than Twilight, wearing a disguise so perfect, so impossibly accurate, that it had defied all scrutiny and logic. Later that same evening, the masterful spy shed the face of the investigator as easily as one might shed a winter coat. He adopted a brand new identity, transforming himself into Robert, a charming, handsome gentleman with a gentle, disarming smile, impeccably styled hair, and a bespoke suit. He sat in a lavish, high-end Austanian restaurant, the soft, melancholic strains of a live string quartet filling the air, dining with a beautiful, elegantly dressed woman named Karen. Karen was not a random conquest. She was the daughter of the very man Twilight had just swindled. As she sipped her expensive sparkling wine, Karen complained bitterly, her brow furrowed in frustration, that her father had been in a foul, unbearable mood all day because some unknown thief had brazenly stolen his prized toupee pictures. Twilight listened with practiced, unwavering interest, offering sympathetic nods and perfectly timed hums of agreement, though his hyperactive mind was already calculating his exit strategy down to the millisecond. Across the opulent restaurant, a young couple erupted in joyous, tearful applause as a man dropped to one knee, proposing marriage in a grand, public display of affection. The romantic atmosphere caught Karen's attention. She turned back to Robert, a wistful, longing gleam in her eye, and brought up the prospect of their own future, hinting heavily at marriage. But Twilight had already secured the intelligence he needed. The mission was complete. He had no further use for Karen, nor her politically connected, easily manipulated father. He looked at her, his expression suddenly, terrifyingly devoid of the warmth and affection Robert had possessed just moments before. In his mind, he finalized the severance with a clinical detachment. "Sorry, Karen, but I have no further use for your family," he thought coldly. He stood from the table, breaking off the relationship with an efficient finality that left her stunned, and simply walked away. As Karen cried out, her voice cracking with sudden heartbreak, "Hey, Robert, wait! You can't just do that to me!" Twilight ignored the bewildered, judgmental stares of the other wealthy patrons and stepped out into the cool, unforgiving night air. Retreating into the deep shadows of a secluded, trash-strewn alleyway, he removed the fake glasses that adorned his face and pulled at the synthetic edges of the Robert mask. With a sharp flick of his silver lighter, he tossed the disguise and the accompanying envelope of intelligence into a burning trash barrel. As the bright orange flames consumed the false identity, turning the rubber and paper to ash, he reflected on the isolated life he had chosen. Marriage? Conventional happiness? I got rid of those aspirations, as well as my identity, the day I became a spy. He watched the fire burn, a solitary phantom in the night, having long ago abandoned the hopes of a normal life for the sake of his solemn duty. The next morning, the city awoke to a blanket of thick, damp gray mist that clung to the towering architecture. Twilight arrived at a bustling, cavernous train station, a sea of commuters rushing past him, utterly oblivious to the invisible war being waged around them. He took a seat on a worn wooden bench, blending perfectly into the morning rush, becoming just another face in the endless crowd. A moment later, a mysterious, hunched old man shuffled over and sat heavily beside him. Without making eye contact, without a single shifting of posture, the two men discreetly exchanged the folded newspapers they were holding. As the old man rose to leave, melting back into the crowd, he muttered a soft, highly peculiar sound. Meow? It was not a sign of madness, but the predetermined, highly classified secret code confirming the successful exchange of a crucial cipher. Twilight boarded the heavy steel train bound for the capital city of Berlin. As the rhythmic, hypnotic clacking of the wheels on the tracks lulled the other passengers into a morning stupor, Twilight opened the newspaper. To the untrained eye, it contained nothing but mundane articles about agricultural yields and local municipal politics. But Twilight's trained eyes quickly picked apart the text, utilizing cipher C to reveal a hidden encoded message from his organization, WISE. The decrypted message began with customary congratulations for his swift and successful retrieval of the toupee photographs, a mission executed with his usual flawless precision. However, the praise was fleeting, quickly replaced by the daunting, unprecedented details of his most critical assignment to date, Operation Strix. His new target was Donovan Desmond, the reclusive, enigmatic, and highly dangerous leader of the National Unity Party. Desmond was a man of extreme, almost pathological caution, a paranoid architect of conflict who posed a catastrophic existential threat to the fragile truce between the East and the West. The instructions detailed that Twilight needed to get close to Desmond to probe his inner circle and uncover any seditious activities or preparations for war. But Desmond never appeared in public, never attended state dinners, and never granted interviews. He had only one vulnerability, one single point of access. He occasionally appeared at the elite, highly exclusive social gatherings held at the prestigious Eden College, the private academic institution attended by his aristocratic sons. To infiltrate these fiercely guarded gatherings, the directive from WISE was clear, uncompromising, and bordering on the absurd. Twilight was required to get married, adopt a child, and successfully enroll that child into Eden College. Twilight stared at the decoded text, his stoic, unbreakable demeanor cracking for just a fraction of a second. The deadline for the school's enrollment period was mere days away. He had exactly 1 week to manufacture a perfectly normal, thoroughly convincing upper-class family out of thin air. The sheer, mathematically improbable absurdity of the timeline shocked the master spy, threatening to overwhelm even his legendary composure. Yet, as the train sped toward the heart of Berlin, Twilight folded the newspaper with precise, sharp movements. He accepted the monumental burden, knowing that the fate of millions, the lives of countless innocents, rested entirely on his shoulders. He would build this family, not for love, not for a desire for connection, but for the sake of a better, more peaceful world. Upon arriving in the grand, sprawling, imposing city of Berlin, Twilight immediately set to work. His first objective was to secure a suitable base of operations disguised as a warm family home. He toured several properties, utilizing his deep understanding of surveillance and tactical architecture, before settling on a modest but comfortable apartment. He meticulously inspected every inch of the rooms, checking behind baseboards, inside light fixtures, and within the ventilation shafts, satisfied only when he found zero evidence of Austanian wiretaps or listening devices. Furthermore, the apartment offered excellent unobstructed escape routes through the rear windows, a necessary precaution for any operative. He signed the lease documents with a steady hand under his newly forged identity, Loid Forger, a respectable, well-to-do psychiatrist. With the nest prepared, Loid required the central, most critical piece of his cover, a child. He navigated the winding, less reputable, poverty-stricken streets of the city until he found a dilapidated, dreary orphanage. The building smelled of damp wood, despair, and boiled cabbage. Loid approached the owner, a gruff, uncaring, disheveled man who seemed vastly more interested in his half-empty bottle of liquor than the welfare of his young charges. Loid began to recite a carefully fabricated, emotionally manipulative story about his wealthy wife and their tragic inability to conceive. But the owner waved a dismissive, heavy hand, interrupting the performance. He lazily told Loid to just look around and take whichever child he wanted, asking absolutely no questions and demanding no formal paperwork. Loid adjusted his glasses, stating in a clear, measured tone that he required a child who was highly intelligent, specifically one that could read and write well enough to pass a rigorous academic entrance exam. The owner scoffed, a harsh, humorless sound, and pointed a lazy, trembling finger toward a small girl with bright pink hair standing quietly in the corner of the room. Her name was Anya. The owner claimed she was the smartest child in the facility, noting that she didn't talk much and was generally a good kid. In reality, the man harbored a deep, unspoken superstition about the girl. He found her unnervingly perceptive, almost creepy in her ability to anticipate his moods, and was utterly desperate to be rid of her. Loid looked down at the diminutive girl. She was small, fragile-looking, with large, expressive green eyes that seemed to hold a vast, unchildlike depth. According to his mission parameters, the child needed to be at least 6 years old to qualify for enrollment at Eden College. Loid's trained eyes calculated her height, bone density, and motor skills, mentally estimating her biological age to be closer to 4 or 5 years old. Before he could voice his critical concern, Anya looked up at him, her eyes locking onto his, and confidently declared, "I'm 6." Loid blinked, slightly taken aback by her sudden assertion. He still found her a bit too short to be 6, a skeptical thought that flashed clearly and vividly across his highly disciplined mind. Immediately, responding to a stimulus Loid could not comprehend, Anya stood up on her tippy toes, puffing out her small chest in a desperate, endearing attempt to make herself appear physically taller. Loid found the behavior odd, but with time running out, he proceeded to the testing phase. He handed her a complex adult-level crossword puzzle, a test specifically designed to gauge advanced vocabulary, historical knowledge, and problem-solving skills. He believed it would be far too difficult for a child, but he needed to establish her baseline cognitive intelligence. As Anya stared at the paper, Loid began solving the puzzle rapidly in his own mind, checking the down and across columns mentally, accessing his vast repository of memorized encyclopedic knowledge. Unbeknownst to Loid and to the rest of the oblivious world, Anya possessed a profound, dangerous, and secret gift. She was an esper, a telepath capable of hearing the thoughts of those around her, the tragic result of shadowy, cruel government experiments. Hearing the answers echoing clearly and perfectly in Loid's mind, Anya quickly, almost effortlessly scribbled them down onto the paper. She handed the completed crossword back to Loid. He stared at the perfectly solved puzzle, utterly astonished. His mind raced to calculate the probability of a child solving such a complex linguistic matrix. The girl was, by all appearances, an absolute prodigy. Excitement surged through the typically stoic spy. With a mind this extraordinarily sharp, she would pass the notoriously difficult Eden College entrance exam with ease. He immediately finalized the adoption, taking her by the hand to lead her out of the dreary, suffocating orphanage. As they walked toward the door, Anya read his lingering, triumphant thoughts. She realized that her new, handsome father was not a boring psychiatrist at all, but a real-life, highly trained spy. A thrill of pure, unadulterated childish excitement washed over her. A spy was far, far better than a normal father. As they walked the bustling cobblestone streets of Berlin toward their new home, Loid began laying the essential, non-negotiable groundwork for their cover. He knelt down to her eye level, his tone serious, instructive, and commanding. He explained that from this exact moment forward, she must tell everyone they met that she had always been his daughter. There was to be absolutely no mention of the orphanage, her past, or the adoption process. Furthermore, she was to address him exclusively and without fail as father. Upon entering their new, fully furnished apartment, Anya was immediately mesmerized by the space. She gravitated toward the television set, turning it on to find a loud, brightly colored animated program filled with explosions, secret bases, and masked heroes. It was Spy Wars, and she proudly, loudly announced to Loid that it was her absolute favorite show. Loid watched her for a moment, a creeping realization settling over him that a child required far more complex logistical support than a lone self-sufficient operative. He needed to acquire appropriate clothing, nutritious food, and most importantly, he needed to forge a highly convincing, flawless birth certificate and identification papers for her. He fetched his heavy trench coat, stating that he would be going out to run these critical errands and that she should wait quietly and safely at the apartment. However, Anya, terrified of being left behind and eager to spend every possible moment with her exciting new spy father, adamantly insisted on accompanying him. Reluctantly, calculating that arguing would waste valuable time, Loid agreed. The city center was a chaotic, overwhelming sea of pedestrians, shouting vendors, and rumbling automobiles. Loid moved with the swift, purposeful, efficient stride of a trained combat agent, and within moments the small, easily distracted Anya was swallowed by the dense crowd. A spike of panic flared briefly in Loid's chest before he located her staring longingly at a storefront window. An older woman passing by scolded Loid gently but firmly, advising him to hold his daughter's hand to keep her close and safe in such a bustling environment. Loid complied, taking Anya's tiny, fragile hand in his own large, calloused one. As they walked hand in hand, Loid's tactical mind raced at 1,000 miles an hour. He thought about how severely this simple domestic act compromised his combat readiness. Holding a child's hand meant his primary arm was occupied, severely limiting his ability to draw a concealed weapon, perform evasive maneuvers, or defend against a sudden enemy ambush. Anya, listening intently to the vivid, violent, highly detailed scenarios playing out in his mind, panicked. The thought of assassins leaping from the alleyways, of bullets flying and knives flashing, terrified her young mind. She yanked her hand away with surprising force, running to hide trembling behind a nearby iron lamppost. Loid stared at her, utterly confused by her sudden, erratic, inexplicable behavior. He rubbed his temples, his mind racing to analyze the situation through a psychological lens. He realized, with a heavy heart, that treating this complex mission purely as a tactical military exercise was failing miserably. To achieve his mission, successfully infiltrate the school, and ultimately keep the fragile peace between the East and West, he had to start understanding the strange, unpredictable creature that was a human child. He needed to build a genuinely good, trusting relationship with her. Hearing his profound internal resolve to be a better father, Anya peeked out from her hiding spot. she decided to help him understand her by stating her preferences clearly and simply. "Anya likes peanuts, but not carrots," she announced brightly, offering him a piece of vital intelligence. Loid blinked, filing the dietary intelligence away in his mental dossiers. They continued their walk until Anya stopped abruptly, pointing excitedly at a sign above a shop window. She declared that she liked crispy bacon. Loid sighed, looking at the sign, and gently corrected her, explaining that the shop was a bakery and they sold pastries, not bacon. A few doors down, they encountered a street vendor selling various memorabilia and toys. Anya's eyes lit up as she spotted a vibrant, action-packed poster for Spy Wars. Desperate to own it, she reached into her small pocket, pulled out a tiny 10-pen coin, and slammed it confidently onto the counter. Loid intervened, shaking his head. He explained the basic foundational principles of Astanian currency to her, noting that the poster cost a full 1 dalk, a significantly higher amount than she possessed. Watching her struggle with simple words, basic vocabulary, and rudimentary math, a cold, heavy dread washed over Loid. He started to wonder if he had made a catastrophic, mission-ending error in judgment. Perhaps Anya was actually quite stupid, and her flawless performance on the complex crossword puzzle had been nothing more than a bizarre, statistically impossible fluke. As he stood there amidst the bustling crowd, he genuinely contemplated returning her to the dreary orphanage and finding another, more capable, more intelligent child. Anya heard these cold, pragmatic thoughts loud and clear. The paralyzing fear of abandonment, of being cast out once again into the cold, uncaring world, overwhelmed her completely. Hot tears welled in her large green eyes, and she began to sob uncontrollably right there on the sidewalk, causing a massive, highly conspicuous public scene. She begged him, her small voice cracking with genuine terror, not to replace her, not to get rid of her for a smarter child. Flustered by the judgmental, piercing stares of the passing townspeople and entirely unequipped to handle raw emotional outbursts, Loid scrambled to soothe her. Remembering her earlier declaration of intelligence, he quickly offered to buy her a large bag of roasted peanuts if she would only stop crying. The promise of her favorite treat worked like magic. Her tears vanished almost instantly, replaced by a radiant, satisfied smile. By the time they finished their shopping and secured the necessary supplies, the intense emotional roller coaster had taken its toll on the little girl. Anya fell fast asleep, forcing Loid to carry her the rest of the way home. Feeling utterly stumped, profoundly exhausted, and entirely out of his depth regarding the vast mysteries of childcare, Loid made a necessary detour to the local library. With Anya dozing softly on his shoulder, the master spy checked out a towering stack of dense academic books on child psychology, early childhood development, and parenting, determined to master this new discipline just as he had mastered cryptography, disguise, and hand-to-hand combat. The following day, Loid was determined to rigorously assess Anya's true academic capabilities and begin her formal education. He set up a makeshift desk in the living room, piling it high with preparatory materials for the Eden College entrance exam. However, Anya, much like any ordinary child faced with daunting academic labor, possessed a profound aversion to hard work. She flatly refused to study. "I need to accurately measure your intelligence before you take the entrance exam," Loid explained, trying to maintain a patient, authoritative tone, drawing upon the manuals he had read the night before. Anya crossed her arms, a smug, defiant expression crossing her face as she relied on her secret advantage. "But I don't need to study to take some stupid old test. I'll read their minds," she almost said aloud, quickly catching herself before revealing her secret. Loid's eyes narrowed suspiciously, detecting a hint of deceit. "I hope you're not planning on cheating."
"Listen, if you don't get into this school, then my mission fails." Realizing he was getting nowhere with the stubborn child and urgently needing to meet with an intelligence contact to secure the necessary forged documents, Loid decided to leave the apartment. Annoyed, he told her to stay home and focus on her books. Despite his strict, explicit orders, Anya still attempted to sneak out and follow him, driven by a fear of being left alone and a desire for adventure. Loid, possessing the heightened, highly tuned senses of a master operative, easily caught him trying to slip past him on the stairs. To ensure she remained safely indoors while he conducted his clandestine meeting, Loid took drastic, almost comical measures. He returned her to the apartment and dragged several heavy pieces of furniture, chairs, a small table, and a bookshelf in front of the front door, effectively barricading her inside. Leaving the apartment physically secured, Loid traveled to a discreet, prearranged location to meet with his trusted informant, a frizzy-haired man named Frankie Franklin. Frankie was a master of logistics, black market acquisitions, and deep-cover intelligence gathering. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table to Loid. Inside were the flawlessly forged application papers, a highly sought-after, incredibly expensive ticket granting entry to the Eden College exam, and a stolen copy of a previous year's test. Frankie then handed over a secondary, much thinner file containing the comprehensive background check Loid had requested on his new daughter.
Frankie apologized for the sparse, highly irregular intelligence. He explained that there were absolutely no official or unofficial records of Anya prior to the last year. It was as if she had simply materialized out of thin air. Within that incredibly short time frame, however, she had been adopted by 4 different, thoroughly vetted families and returned to the grim orphanage every single time. The dark revelation deeply troubled Loid, hinting at a profound, unspoken trauma within the child and explaining her desperate, clinging behavior the day prior. Meanwhile, back at the barricaded apartment, Anya quickly grew bored with her dense, uninteresting textbooks. Remembering that Loid had carefully locked a mysterious silver briefcase full of his fascinating spy equipment in the bedroom, she decided to investigate. Using a discarded hairpin and a surprising amount of dexterity, she clumsily but successfully picked the lock on the secure case. Inside, she found a mesmerizing array of dials, switches, cryptography tools, and a highly advanced long-range radio transmitter. Treating the delicate espionage equipment like a toy from her favorite television show, she began flipping switches and speaking dramatically into the microphone. Unintentionally, she tuned into an unencrypted frequency heavily monitored by the Ostanian underground. Pretending to be the legendary master spy she had seen on TV, she broadcasted a taunting, childish message, claiming to be Twilight and daring the notorious, recently humiliated Minister Edgar to come and find her. Having had her fun, Anya turned off the machine. But as the hum of the electronics died away, a sudden, chilling fear gripped her small heart. If her new father found out she had been playing with his highly classified secret tools, he would surely think she was a bad, disobedient girl and throw her away, just like all the other families had. She frantically began to clean up the equipment, putting everything back exactly as she had found it, her hands trembling. As she worked, the oppressive silence of the apartment allowed dark, suppressed memories to creep into her mind. She remembered the cold, sterile, blindingly white walls of the laboratory where she was born and raised. She remembered the men in crisp white coats, the cold-eyed scientists who referred to her not by a name, but only as a designated test subject. They had forced her to study relentlessly, punishing her severely if she failed to use her telepathic powers to their exact, grueling specifications. They never allowed her to play, to draw, or to experience the simple joys of being a child.
They constantly, aggressively reminded her that her powers were a dangerous secret that must never, under any circumstances, be revealed to the outside world. Sitting on the floor of the bedroom, staring at the locked briefcase, a profound, crushing sadness washed over her. She realized with solemn, heartbreaking clarity that she was still hiding. Just as she had hidden her true self from the cruel scientists and the neglectful orphanage staff, she must now hide her incredible abilities from Loid. If he ever discovered she was a freak, a mind-reading mutant, he would abandon her too. When Loid returned to the apartment building later that afternoon, his highly trained instincts immediately flared, warning of imminent danger. The heavy barricade he had painstakingly constructed against the front door had been forcefully, violently shoved aside, leaving the wooden door slightly ajar. He drew his concealed weapon with lightning speed and slipped into the apartment with silent, measured, predatory steps. The moment he crossed the threshold, figures emerged from the deep shadows. A group of heavily armed, ruthless thugs ambushed him in his own home. Loid moved like liquid, his advanced combat training taking over his conscious thought. He parried a lethal knife thrust, disarmed a gunman with a brutal twist of the wrist, and incapacitated the attackers with swift, bone-breaking efficiency. But as the dust settled and the agonizing groans of the unconscious men filled the ruined living room, a horrifying, sickening realization struck him. Anya was nowhere to be found. He searched the rooms frantically, his heart hammering against his ribs. From the looks of it, I've been compromised, he thought, his mind racing through threat assessment protocols. I need to find her immediately. Calm down. He concluded that his enemies had tracked him down, likely via a compromised transmission, and kidnapped the girl. As he stood amidst the wreckage of his meticulously planned cover, a dark, incredibly pragmatic thought entered his mind. He considered simply running away, abandoning the completely compromised identity of Loid Forger, leaving the girl to her fate, and starting Operation Strix all over again, with a brand new face and a new child. It was the logical, safe, spy-approved course of action. Before the thought could fully crystallize into action, the soft creak of a floorboard betrayed a final, hidden attacker. A man lunged from behind a shattered doorframe, striking Loid with a heavy, blunt object. The world exploded into stars and then went entirely black. Miles away, in a derelict, echoing, abandoned warehouse situated by the foggy docks, Anya was tied securely to a harsh wooden chair. She trembled violently as Edgar, the disgraced and furious foreign minister, paced before her like a caged predator. Edgar had intercepted the radio transmission and brought a small, heavily armed army of his mafia associates to lay an inescapable trap. He sneered at the crying child, declaring his cruel intention to use her as a hostage to force the legendary Twilight to return the stolen photographs of his toupee, a matter of immense political and personal pride. One of Edgar's lower-ranking men stepped forward, nervously suggesting that they perhaps abandon the petty squabble over a hairpiece, given the monumental danger of engaging a legendary Westalian spy. Edgar's eyes darkened with rage. Without a single word of warning, he drew a pistol and shot the man dead on the spot, the gunshot echoing like thunder in the cavernous space. He coldly explained to the terrified room that absolute transparency was essential in government, and that the man he had just executed was a traitor secretly backing the West. Just then, the heavy, rusted warehouse doors rolled open with a screech. The rest of Edgar's men returned from the apartment raid, straining as they dragged a large, heavy canvas bag across the rough concrete floor. They proudly, arrogantly announced they had captured the elusive Twilight. Edgar, grinning triumphantly, stepped forward and yanked the bag open. To his absolute paralyzing bewilderment, the bruised face looking up from inside the bag did not belong to the spy. It was one of his own men, a thug named Wen. Edgar spun around in a blind panic. He looked toward the corner where the man who had dragged the bag in had been standing, the man he had assumed was Wen, but the fake Wen was already gone, and so was the hostage, Anya. Outside the warehouse, Loid, having flawlessly, rapidly disguised himself as one of the thugs to infiltrate the building, sprinted down the narrow, rain-slicked alleyways with Anya tucked firmly under his arm. His breath was ragged, his mind consumed by a furious, blinding storm of self-reproach. He considered himself an absolute pathetic failure of a spy. He had broken the cardinal rule of his profession. He had allowed himself to be distracted by sentimentality, risking the fate of 2 entire nations to rescue a single insignificant orphan. In his arms, Anya, completely overwhelmed by the explosive violence and the sheer, unadulterated terror of the ordeal, buried her face in his chest and began to weep uncontrollably. The sound of her crying struck Loid like a physical blow, penetrating his emotional armor. It was a sound he despised above all others, for it served as a brutal, inescapable mirror to his own tragic past. He closed his eyes as he ran, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment, he was no longer Twilight, the invincible master spy. He was a small, helpless boy again, standing completely alone in the smoking rubble of a bombed-out city, surrounded by the devastating destruction of war, utterly helpless, able to do nothing but cry. He stopped in a secluded, walled courtyard, setting Anya gently on her feet. He looked down at her tear-stained face, his heart aching. How could I forget, he thought. The vivid memory of his own childhood pain solidified his resolve and reminded him of his true purpose: to create a world where children won't have to cry. That's why I became a spy. He knelt before her, gently wiping the tears from her dirt-smudged cheeks. He forced a reassuring, incredibly warm smile and told her in a calm, playful voice that they were just playing a highly elaborate, exciting game of tag. He pulled a small note from his pocket, pressed it securely into her hand, and instructed her to run to the nearest police station and show it to the officers. He assured her she would be completely safe. Watching her small form run bravely down the street toward safety, Loid definitively rejected the narc notion that he was a failure. He had made a grave tactical error by putting a little girl in danger, yes, but protecting the innocent was the very core, the absolute foundation of his mission. He turned back toward the looming, ominous silhouette of the warehouse. The game was far from over.
Loid slipped back into the warehouse grounds like a vengeful phantom. Moving with lethal, mathematical precision, he rigged the entrances, exits, and narrow corridors with a series of makeshift, highly effective, non-lethal traps. When Edgar and his heavily armed men finally rushed out into the yard to pursue the escapees, they triggered the tripwires. Massive, suspended bags of industrial baking flour, positioned perfectly among the rafters, plummeted to the ground, exploding into thick, blinding, suffocating white clouds. Coughing violently and completely blinded by the dense dust, the thugs panicked, firing their weapons blindly into the haze. In the chaos, Loid moved invisibly among them. He struck from the shadows, dismantling the gang one by one with rapid, precise, debilitating strikes until the groans of fallen men echoed through the flour-filled air. When the dust finally settled, only Edgar remained standing, trembling violently and deeply disoriented. Suddenly, he felt the cold, unforgiving steel of a pistol barrel press firmly against the back of his head. "How is Karen doing?" a voice whispered from the darkness. Edgar froze, his eyes widening in absolute paralyzing terror. How could this masked assailant possibly know the name of his beloved daughter? Loid stepped into Edgar's peripheral vision, his expression devoid of all mercy. He explained, simply and chillingly, that he was a spy, and that a spy knows absolutely everything. He leaned in close, his voice a dangerous low rumble. He promised Edgar that if he ever came near Loid or his family again, or if he breathed a single word of this night to anyone, the consequences would be severe and permanent. Loid threatened the politician with mutually assured destruction, demanding he back off entirely if he wished for his daughter, Karen, to live a long, normal, and happy life. The psychological warfare worked perfectly. Broken and terrified, Edgar surrendered. Loid walked away from the docks, the combat adrenaline slowly draining from his system, leaving a bone-deep, overwhelming exhaustion in its wake. As he navigated the quiet streets back toward the police station, a small figure emerged from the shadows of a flickering street lamp. It was Anya. She had not gone to the police. She had waited for him. As she ran up to him, Loid quickly composed himself, acting as though he knew nothing of the violence that had just transpired. He feigned surprise, asking her gently why she was outside the house so late. Anya, playing along with the ruse to protect her secret, explained that she had been playing a fun game of tag with some old guys, but it had gotten a bit too scary, and she just wished to go home with her dad. Looking at her innocent face, Loid recalled the harsh reality of her file, the 4 previous adoptions, the 4 cruel rejections. He knew he could not send her back to that life. He sighed, a genuine, weary smile touching his lips, and agreed to take her home. He told her, however, that they would have to find a brand new apartment immediately, offering the flimsy but acceptable excuse that he had found a very large snake in their old one. In the days that followed, Loid rented a new, even safer apartment and threw himself entirely into preparing Anya for the Eden College entrance exam. He recognized her extreme aversion to studying, so he adapted his methods. He procured the stolen copy of the exam answers. "You will need to study," he told her firmly, tapping the paper. "But I have the answers right here. You don't need to learn the complex material. You only need to remember these exact responses." The day of the highly anticipated exam arrived, bringing with it a palpable, suffocating atmosphere of tension. Hundreds of children, dressed in their finest tailored clothes, sat at heavy wooden desks in the grand, echoing halls of Eden College. When the test papers were distributed, Anya closed her eyes and attempted her usual trick. She reached out with her mind, intending to effortlessly pluck the answers from the brilliant students around her. Instead, she was hit by a deafening, agonizing wall of mental static. The hall was filled with the frantic, overlapping, terrified thoughts of panicked children who had absolutely no idea how to solve the complex problems. Her telepathy was entirely useless in a room full of ignorance. Panic threatened to consume her, but then she remembered the long hours sitting at the table with Loid. She remembered his patient voice, his strict instructions, and the shapes of the answers he had made her memorize. Gripping her pencil tightly, she focused her own mind and began to write down everything she had studied. Days later, the campus courtyard was filled with anxious families crowding around a large wooden bulletin board displaying the numbers of the passing students. Loid, his heart in his throat, scanned the endless columns of text, and there, near the middle of the board, was Anya's number. She had passed. A wave of profound, unfamiliar elation washed over the stoic spy. He scooped Anya up into his arms, rejoicing and spinning her around in a rare display of unbridled, genuine emotion. But as the adrenaline of the past week's impossible trials finally evaporated, the sheer crushing exhaustion of sudden fatherhood, espionage, and near-death experiences hit him all at once. To the shock of the surrounding upper-class families, the great Twilight's eyes rolled back and he fell flat onto the manicured grass, passed out from pure, unadulterated fatigue. Later that afternoon, the late autumn sun cast long, golden shadows across the forager's new living room. Loid lay sprawled on the couch, dead to the world in a deep, restorative sleep. The silence of the apartment was only broken by the sharp rattle of the mail slot. Anya trotted over to the door and picked up a crisp, wax-sealed envelope bearing the prestigious crest of Eden College. Recognizing its importance, she tiptoed over to the couch and nudged Loid's arm, trying to give it to him. When he didn't stir, she simply climbed up onto the cushions and curled up beside him, falling asleep peacefully against his chest. When Loid finally drifted awake, he was momentarily disoriented, surprised to find himself having slept so soundly and deeply in the presence of another person, a vulnerability he had not allowed himself in years. Anya woke as well, rubbing her eyes, and proudly handed him the letter. Loid broke the seal and unfolded the heavy parchment. His eyes scanned the formal, cursive script. The letter congratulated them on passing the rigorous written exam. However, it went on to detail the strict, uncompromising requirements for the final hurdle of the admissions process. Loid stared at the words, the blood slowly draining from his face. The admissions process consists of 2 phases, the entrance exam and the family interview, the text read, implicitly demanding that the family unit be absolutely complete and traditionally structured. Loid slowly lowered the letter, looking down at the small, pink-haired girl sitting on his couch. They had survived assassinations, deciphered impossible codes, and miraculously conquered the written exam. But a bureaucratic technicality now threatened to destroy Operation Strix entirely. Loid and Anya looked at each other, a silent, shared realization passing between them. They had a child, they had a father, but to pass the towering iron gates of Eden College, they were faced with a brand new, seemingly impossible problem. They did not have a mother.